Now I must take you from the realm of rationality and moral agency to the realm of unreason and slavery, and into the mindset of the slaves of Allah and the Islamic theology that underlies the genocidal axis and the will to genocide in the Middle East and in the Islamic world in general today. Eric noted that there were 80,000 Jews in Egypt in 1933, and there have been Jewish communities all over the Middle East from time immemorial up until 1948, when those communities were decimated and the Jews were expelled from them en masse, such that there is only, for example, one Jew left in Afghanistan out of several thousand there 100 years ago. There were churches and Christians from time immemorial, from long before Islam, in the Middle East as well. Egypt, for example, was a 99% Christian country at the time of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, and it is now about 10 to 15% Christian. But one of the things that has been happening recently, as Eric also noted, is that the Brotherhood is burning churches and destroying Christian communities wholesale. Now, this is also something that is not solely limited to the Brotherhood, but is carried out by other Islamic groups and has been going on for longer than just the upheaval that has been engulfing Egypt ever since the Brotherhood first took power in 2011 and then was removed from power subsequently by the military. What we see, for example, in as far back as 2006 is the Melkite Greek Catholic Patriarch Gregory III saying that there was a concerted effort, an organized effort to expel all the Christians from the Middle East. And in the 7 years since then, that effort has only gained strength and has expanded in its scope. But it becomes then a question. Why is this happening now? Why is it that Jews lived in the Muslim world and under Muslim rule up until 1948 and were not forcibly expelled? Why is it that Christians lived in the Muslim world and under Muslim rule up until quite recently, but now there is this concerted effort that the Melkite Greek Catholic Patriarch referred to drive them out, and churches are being burned, and so on? Now, most analysts, particularly in Washington, would answer that question by saying, well, see, it's because Islam is a religion of peace, and these Muslim Brotherhood operatives and the others like them are twisting and hijacking its peaceful teachings to create this virulent form of Islam that can't abide the other within its presence and is driving them out. But if we can just get the real, true Muslims in there, then everything will be okay. And unfortunately, this is a position that prevails among both parties in Washington, among all mainstream analysts, and everyone pretty much takes it for granted. The only problem with it is that it is wholly and entirely false. There is no truth to the idea that there is some group of Muslims that we can put in power or support in their efforts to gain power in the Middle East that will stop this from happening. And the reasons for that lie within Islamic theology. So if you could open your Qur'ans now, we're going to look at a few passages. One of them is chapter 9, verse 29, which says, "Fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book," that is, the Jews and the Christians primarily, "until they pay the jizya," which is a tax, "with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." That is the foundation of what I'm sure you have heard of as dimitude, the institutionalized discrimination and harassment of Jews and Christians in the Islamic State. But the word dhimma means protection, and the dhimmis are protected people. Now you remember the mafia. You know, you pay protection to the mafia and they don't smash your store window. You pay protection to the Muslim government and you have the right to live and to practice your religion, to live as a Jew or Christian. But you still have to pay. You pay the tax and you are denied basic rights, so that in your humiliated and subjugated status, you are always reminded every day that you have rejected Muhammad, rejected Islam, rejected the truth, hellfire awaits you, and deprivation and suffering in this world as well, and that the Muslims have the responsibility to enforce. Now, the dhimma, the system of subjugation of the Jews and Christians, is the law of Islam. It's Sharia. But it has not been enforced in the Islamic world since the 1850s. The Ottoman Empire, the last Islamic empire, abolished the dhimma in 1856 under pressure from the West. Egypt abolished it around the same time, also under pressure from the West. And the Arab nationalist governments that came to power in the middle part of the 20th century and ruled most of the Middle East up until quite recently, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak in Egypt, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Bourguiba before him, the Assads in Syria, Saddam Hussein in Iraq. These were Muslims, but they were, aside from the Assads, but they were not ruling according to Islamic law. They were ruling according to the Ba'athist philosophy of Arab nationalism, which was a race-based socialist ideology derived from Western European fascism with a mixture of other ideas derived from the Soviet Union and socialist notions that were going around Europe at the time, and of course are stronger than ever in some quarters. And they essentially granted equal rights to the non-Muslim minorities, up until the founding of the State of Israel. At the time of the founding of the State of Israel, then suddenly the Jews are all expelled from these Middle Eastern countries, although the Christians continued to live in relative peace up until recently. What happened to both communities is the same. They were set upon by elements within those countries that, even though they were ruled by the Arab nationalists, we were talking about Muslim countries, and there was still a strong undercurrent within all of these nations for the reimposition of Islamic law. And the idea that the governments that they were living under had no legitimacy because they did not obey Islamic law. And this is why the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed in Egypt by those Arab nationalist governments, because they had broad popular support since their political philosophy was based in Islamic law, and so Muslims saw it as part of their Islamic identity and Islamic responsibility to be aligned with groups like the Brotherhood. But the Arab nationalist regimes saw their enemy and recognized their enemy when they saw him, and so they outlawed these groups. The problem is that at the same time they had to offer carrots as well as sticks to these groups because they did enjoy so much popular support. And so, in other words, the elements of Islamic law that victimized Jews and Christians remained a strong cultural subcurrent within those countries, were never eradicated, never explicitly rejected, and often explicitly appealed to, not only by the Muslim Brotherhood and groups like it, but even by these Arab governments, in order to curry favor and to secure the popularity of the regime and to make sure that the regimes did not get overthrown. In Islamic law, if you rebel against the rule of the Muslims, if you reject the overlordship of the Muslims, if you say, I don't want to live as a subjugated second-class citizen, having to step off the sidewalk when the Muslims are passing and not being able to get a good job because only Muslims can have authority over other Muslims, and so I have to have the most menial job in society where I don't have authority over any Muslim. I have to live with all this kind of institutionalized harassment. If you reject it, then the protection is revoked. Just like if you don't pay the mafia, they will break your windows. So, when Israel was founded, it was widely assumed in the Islamic world that the Jews are at war with Islam now. They're not accepting the rule of the Muslims. They're not accepting the overlordship of the Muslims. They are at war with Islam and their lives are forfeit. And so they were killed, they were massacred, they were expelled from those countries. Now, the same thing is happening now with the Christians. The Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt, and they announced their intention to impose Islamic law in Egypt, and they adopted a constitution that said just that. Islamic law mandates the subjugation of the Christians, but the Christians have been living in this Arab nationalist regime for 50 years and had not suffered under the dhimma since the 1850s. The Christians said, well, no, we're not going to accept that. And there were Coptic leaders who said, we will resist the imposition of the dhimma to the point of martyrdom. When you're talking about 10 to 15% of the society, that's saying, we're going to plunge this country into civil war if you enforce Islamic law upon us. And so the Muslim Brotherhood saw that, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood, they're by-the-book Muslims. They read the Quran, they understand Islamic law. They don't have to bother with all the deceptive nonsense that we have blanketing the public discourse in the United States about how it's really a religion of peace, and they don't believe any of these things. And so the Muslim Brotherhood leaders said, okay, you will not accept the dhimma, you will not take the contract of protection, then you have no protection. And the churches are being burned, and the Christians are being killed. And it's exactly the same phenomenon happening for exactly the same reason. When the contract of protection is revoked, the dhimmis' lives are forfeit. And the contract of protection is revoked if they refuse to accept the dhimma. Hamas in Gaza has said when they consolidate their power, which means when they take over Judea and Samaria as well, then they will impose the dhimma over the remaining Christians there. The Syrian jihadis have said the same thing. This is part of Islamic law. It has never been reformed. It has never been rejected. And there is no school of Islamic jurisprudence that does not teach this institutionalized discrimination. So when the Christians reject it, their lives are forfeit. And this is exactly what we are seeing now. They are kuffar harbi, infidels at war with Islam. And this is a theological designation within Islamic law that makes their blood halal, which means their blood is acceptable to be shed. And indeed, the Muslims have the responsibility to wage war against such people and to kill such people wherever possible. And so, one of the biggest failures of the Obama administration is his betrayal of the Christians in Egypt and all across the Middle East, and his failure, his refusal to speak out. But we also have to acknowledge that one of the biggest failures of the Republican Party is its failure to hold Obama's feet to the fire and demand that he make American aid to those nations contingent upon their treatment of religious minorities. One of the biggest failures of the Republican Party in 2012 and of Mitt Romney in that third debate, the foreign policy debate, where he should have delineated his position from Obama's most starkly, was that all he could say was "me too." And Obama said, we have to arm the rebels in Syria. And Romney said, oh yes, we do indeed. Well then, what was the point? I was watching that, and you know, I'm sorry, this is the only issue I care about, and I thought I don't have any reason to vote for either one of those guys, because the rebels in Syria are jihadis who are going to impose Islamic law in Syria. They will be enemies of the United States no matter how many billions of dollars we give them, and how many roads and hospitals and everything else that we build, schools that we build. And they're going to murder the non-Muslims, the Alawites as well as the Christians in Syria, wholesale. And of course, now we're giving them weapons. And it seems as if, for whatever combination of reasons, there are very few people, and I'm very proud and honored to stand in the room. I see Congressman Gomert over here, and of course Congressman Franks on the dais. There are people in the Republican Party who understand this issue. I strongly urge that everyone who has access to politicians who are running for office or who are contemplating running for office or who are in office now to try to impress upon them the gravity of this situation and the reality of the fact that there is no moderate Muslim group or peaceful Muslim group or self-professed moderate Muslim group that we can throw our support behind that is not going to go along with this same program, and we're kidding ourselves if we think otherwise. These are elements of Islamic law that no sect of Islam rejects. Not a one. And It is a scandal of extraordinary proportions that we are it's the United States of America, we are aiding and abetting the genocide of these people. But we are when we give weapons to the Syrian rebels. And this has to be a campaign issue in 14 and in 16, or it's only going to get worse. People are afraid, I think, in the Republican Party to take this stance and to say that American aid would be contingent upon equal rights for the religious minorities in those countries, because they think that it would be tarred as racist and bigoted and Islamophobic. And of course, it would be. But, well, join the club. The fact is that, as we saw in the first panel, this kind of personal attack and tarring is going to be done to anyone who stands up honestly and deals with these issues. But if we don't, more people are going to die. And so it's a matter of, are we willing to stand up and take some heat? Or are we going to consign these people to their fate? And I hope, as the United States of America that has always been the bastion of freedom, we will take the latter path. Thank you.